Some killers cheat death once, but what if the executioner fails and the nightmare continues? Kenneth Smith. State: Alabama. It began with a pastor's betrayal. In 1988, Charles Sennett, a Church of Christ preacher in Alabama, orchestrated the brutal murder of his wife, Elizabeth Sennett. The motive? Life insurance and a growing mountain of debt. He hired two men, John Forrest Parker and Kenneth Smith, paying them $1,000 each to end her life. On March 18th, Elizabeth was attacked in her home. She was beaten and stabbed 8 times in the chest and neck. The scene was gruesome. Her blood pooled across the floor, her face bruised and swollen beyond recognition. Her last moments were agonizing. Within days, Charles took his own life, but Kenneth Smith was caught, tried, and sentenced to death. His first scheduled execution was in November 2022. But for 4 agonizing hours, Alabama officials failed to insert an IV line. They punctured his arms, hands, chest, and even under his collarbone. Smith lay strapped to the gurney, bleeding and screaming. One official jammed a needle into his clavicle in a desperate attempt to access a central vein. He later described the ordeal as torture, comparing it to being crucified upside down. The execution was halted, but Alabama wasn't done. On January 25, 2024, the state became the first in the U.S. to execute a person using nitrogen hypoxia, a method that replaces oxygen with pure nitrogen. Smith was strapped to the gurney, a mask placed over his face. Witnesses watched as he convulsed violently for 25 minutes before finally going still. His last words, muffled by the mask, "Alabama made humanity take a step back." Rommel Broom. State: Ohio. Rommel Broom's crime was nothing short of monstrous. In 1984, 14-year-old Trina Middleton was walking home after a football game in East Cleveland. Broom abducted her, brutally raped her, and then murdered her in cold blood. Her body was dumped and found days later. The crime shocked the community, and DNA evidence eventually led to Broom's arrest and conviction. He was sentenced to death. But on September 15, 2009, when Ohio attempted to carry out the execution, things went horribly wrong. For over 2 hours, executioners tried to find a usable vein. They jabbed Broom repeatedly in his arms, hands, legs, and even feet. He winced, groaned, and cried out as needles missed veins and hit muscle. At one point, he even tried to assist the team, moving his body to make the search easier. But it was all in vain. Blood streamed down his limbs. Bruises formed quickly. The trauma was so severe that officials called off the execution. His lawyers sued, claiming the failed execution amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. Despite a new execution date being set for 2022, it never happened. Broom died in prison in December 2020 from COVID-19 complications, leaving justice unfinished and a grieving family without closure. If you're still watching, drop a like and subscribe. These stories only get stranger and darker. William Duell. State: England. William Duell was just 16 when he was convicted of a heinous crime in 18th century London. Along with a group of boys, he was accused of abducting, sexually assaulting, and murdering a young woman named Sarah Griffin. Her body had been dumped in a field, and reports said she had been brutally beaten before death. Duell's trial was swift, and the sentence was death by hanging. On November 24, 1740, he was taken to the infamous Tyburn Gallows, where he was hanged alongside 4 other convicts. His body dangled for the customary 20 minutes before being cut down. As was the practice, his body was delivered to a local medical school for dissection. But when surgeons stripped him for the autopsy, something shocking happened. He gasped, a slow, shallow breath. Then another. Duell had survived the execution. The surgeons quickly worked to revive him, administering hot blankets and stimulants. By the next day, he was fully conscious. He had no memory of the hanging. News of his survival spread across London, and public sentiment shifted. He was eventually pardoned on the grounds of divine intervention. But instead of freedom, he was sentenced to penal transportation, shipped off to the American colonies to live out the rest of his life in exile. John Lee. State: England. They called him the man they couldn't hang, but John Lee's story begins with blood. In 1884, Lee was a servant at the home of Emma Keese, a wealthy widow in Devon. One morning, Emma was found murdered, her skull split open with a hatchet, her throat slashed, and her body set on fire. Suspicion immediately fell on Lee. He had a criminal record, and cuts on his arm raised questions. He insisted on his innocence, but the circumstantial evidence was enough. He was sentenced to death. February 23, 1885. Lee walked to the gallows. The noose was secured. The lever was pulled. Nothing happened. A second attempt. Still nothing. A third, again, failure. The trapdoor refused to budge. Baffled, officials removed Lee and tested the mechanism. It worked perfectly, except when Lee stood on it. After 3 failed attempts, the execution was halted. The public, captivated by the spectacle, began to believe it was divine intervention. His sentence was commuted to life in prison. Years later, new evidence cast doubt on his guilt. In 1907, John Lee was released. But his story didn't end in triumph. He spent his remaining years in obscurity, living in poverty and illness. Some reports claim he died in a mental institution. Others say he moved to the U.S. and passed away quietly in Milwaukee. For more stories of killers who escaped a deadly fate, hit that subscribe button and don't miss what's coming next. Anne Green. State: England. Anne Green's story begins with shame and ends with legend. In 1650, Anne was a young maid working for Sir Thomas Red in Oxfordshire. She became pregnant by his grandson, a scandalous secret she tried to hide. At just 17 weeks, she miscarried. Fearing punishment, she buried the fetus. But when it was discovered, she was accused of infanticide. There was no mercy. At Oxford Castle, she was sentenced to hang. On December 14th, Anne was led to the scaffold. The rope was tied. The crowd watched as she swung for 30 minutes. When the body was finally cut down, it was placed in a coffin and sent to Oxford University for dissection. But Anne wasn't dead. As surgeons prepared their tools, one of them noticed a slight breath, then another. Her pulse flickered. They worked to revive her, pouring hot liquids down her throat, rubbing her limbs, and placing her near a fireplace. Hours later, Anne opened her eyes. Her survival sparked outrage and awe. Religious groups called it a miracle. Legal scholars debated the ethics of retrying her. Eventually, she was pardoned. Anne Green lived. She married, had children, and reportedly died of natural causes in 1659. Her case became a symbol of injustice, resilience, and the cruel twists of fate. These weren't just executions gone wrong. These were moments when the system failed and fate stepped in. But survival doesn't always mean freedom. For some, escaping death was just the start of a darker chapter. So, what do you think? If a person survives execution, should they go free or face it again?